The arrest and trials of Jesus stand as the greatest travesty of justice in history, yet it leads to the greatest act of mercy, grace, and redemption in history. So join me today as we examine the arrest of Jesus and see how it is unjustly carried out, but even more importantly, the greater lessons we'll learn about the love and grace of God. As we have seen, 22 laws or rules of the Jewish high courts were broken in the arrest and trials of Jesus. We now turn to the scripture to see how these laws were broken and the lessons Jesus taught us. Even during this time when the powers of darkness seem to be getting the upper hand. Now, for today's study, we will be in Mark chapter 14, Matthew 26, Luke 22, and John 18. Now, in the interest of time, I'll be referring to most of these passages throughout, but will not read the passage itself. So please pause the video long enough to read each passage as we come to it. So we begin in John chapter 18 and verse 2, where John records the first rule that was broken. It's an arrest coming as the result of a bribe. When Judas came to the leaders, they were pleased to have his help. You'll remember that Judas was useful to the religious leaders for three reasons in pulling off this conspiracy. First of all, to show them where they could arrest Jesus away from the crowds that had gathered in Jerusalem for the Passover. The second usefulness that he had was to make an accusation against Jesus to the Roman governor so that the governor would release a Roman cohort that would go and arrest Jesus. And then the third thing is to testify at the Roman trial. Now, here we find Judas fulfilling the first of these three purposes. He provided a place to arrest Jesus away from the crowds. Those crowds that had gathered in Jerusalem for Passover, and probably well over 1 million people are in Jerusalem at this time for Passover. Now, how does Judas know where to find Jesus? Well, remember, Judas had been a disciple of Jesus for some time. He knew the habits of Jesus. He knew that one of his habits was that when he came to Jerusalem, he would go to the Garden of Gethsemane for a time of prayer. And although this is the only time the Gospels mention this, John tells us that Jesus often met there with his disciples. Now, at least 3 times a year, Jesus came to Jerusalem, possibly more often. He would come at the times of the feasts to fulfill the law of Moses, which Jesus kept the law of Moses to the most minute detail. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane became the place of his prayer time. Therefore, Judas could show them where he could be arrested apart from the multitudes. We also see how he fulfilled his second purpose. So, read now John chapter 18 and verse 3. This is where rule number 2 is broken. You see, no steps of criminal proceeding are to occur after sunset. Now, how do we know that it's still nighttime? Well, John records that they came carrying lanterns and torches. So it's still nighttime. And they break the second rule on our list of rules. We also see Judas fulfilling his second purpose to the Jewish leaders. He arrives with a Roman cohort. Now, what is significant about the fact that Judas has received this Roman cohort? Well, a Roman cohort could not be released to make an arrest until someone first appeared before the Roman governor, accusing someone of a crime punishable by Roman law. So Judas has now fulfilled his second purpose in this conspiracy. He appeared before the Roman governor and made the accusation. But under what circumstances did he do it? Well, an important condition of this conspiracy was that no action would be taken until after the festival in order to avoid a riot. And so carrying out the arrest on this night was to be out of the question. So why did they do it on this night when it really was not according to their conspiracy, according to their plan? Well, when Jesus twice identified Judas as the betrayer, he forced their hand. It became obvious to Judas that Jesus knew about the conspiracy. And so when he left the Passover meal, he went to the chief priests who paid him. Obviously, they were afraid that they would lose the opportunity to arrest him because he might simply escape them, as he had done so many times previously. So they hastily took Judas to Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate would normally be stationed in Caesarea Philippi. Now, this is 2 days away from Jerusalem to the west on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Pilate stayed there, but he always came up to Jerusalem to help maintain order during the festivals, which was convenient. Now, just an interesting note. When we visit Caesarea Philippi on the Mediterranean in Israel, we do find a reference to Pontius Pilate in the ruins there at Caesarea Philippi, which I'll show on the screen here to my right. So they brought Judas to Pontius Pilate and accused Jesus of a crime punishable by Roman law. And that is how he received a cohort of Roman soldiers to go arrest this man Jesus. Now, this helps explain a couple of things. First, it helps to explain why, in the initial stages of the Jewish trial, things are very confused and disorganized. You see, they're not quite ready to act, their hands being forced. They don't have their act together. They have to go out and find false witnesses, and it takes them a while to finally get their part of the trial organized. And secondly, it helps to explain that although it is the wee hours of the morning, why Pilate is dressed and ready to conduct the trial. He was anticipating a trial because he had already released the Roman cohort to Judas to make the arrest. Now, how many came to arrest Jesus? This is really fascinating. Now, Mark and Luke call it a crowd. Matthew says it was a large crowd. John gives us some more detail. Just how big was this crowd which came to arrest this one individual? Well, first of all, there is the Roman cohort. Well, just how big is a Roman cohort? The Roman cohort was anywhere from 400 up to 600 soldiers. But they were not alone. The second group that John mentions is the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Now, this would be the Jewish temple police. They are mentioned again in Luke chapter 22, verse 52. Who else does Luke mention here? Well, he also mentions the chief priests and the elders. These are the two categories of Sanhedrin members, and they participate in the arrest, which, by the way, is unlawful. So here is the violation of the third rule. Judges or Sanhedrin members were not allowed to participate in the arrest, but they do so anyway. And there is also a fourth significant thing. There's a significant individual in this party that has come to arrest Jesus. And John at chapter 18 and verse 10 tells us who it is. He is the servant of the high priest. Now, what is the significance of his presence in this party? Well, as we've seen, the other Pharisees and Sadducees are there. The high priest in this instance would have probably come, even though it was unlawful. But because these were the crucial hours between the first night of the Passover and the first day of the Passover, during those crucial hours, the high priest could not leave the temple compound lest he come into contact with something to make himself unclean. And if he became unclean, he could not offer up the special Passover sacrifice to be offered upon the first day of Passover. Therefore, he could not leave the compound. So what did he do? Well, he sent out his servant. And according to Jewish law, your servant represented you. Therefore, in essence, he was there. And the servant was there to make sure that things went as they were supposed to, and Jesus was arrested. So as Matthew points out, there's a large crowd with Judas, 400 to 600 Roman soldiers and their commanders, a number of temple police, the chief priests, the elders, and the servant of the high priest. And as this large body of men comes to arrest one individual, Jesus takes the initiative. Now, read John chapter 18, 4 through 9, before we go forward. Now, in this passage, we see that Jesus is fully aware of all the things that were coming upon him. And he takes the initiative by going forth to meet them and asking them, "Whom do you seek?" Now, why did he ask them this question? Well, and he asked them 2 separate times. Well, there are two different ways to understand the phrase here. As he responds, he says, "I am who you seek." I am he. So as it is written here, number one, it's probably the same I am that Jehovah used when he revealed himself to Moses as I am that I am. So the first time that Jesus said, "I am he," it was a display of his deity. And as a consequence of that display, how did this crowd respond? Well, it says they all fell down backward to the ground. Now, this shows who is in control. Now, remember, there's 400 to 600 Roman soldiers, the temple police, the elders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the representative from the high priest Malchus. Judas is there. And when Jesus says, "I am he," they all fall backwards. Now, when people encountered the Lord in a positive sense in Scripture, they didn't fall backward. They fell forward. Falling backward is not a blessing, but a sign of judgment. Now, the second way to understand these words is simply, I am he. I am that Jesus that you are looking for. So after showing them who is in control, he repeats the question, "Whom do you seek?" And when they answer Jesus the Nazarene, he uses the simple, "I am he." I'm the one you're looking for. He also protects his disciples here by telling the arresting crowd to let his disciples go. So Jesus takes the initiative with 2 purposes in mind. Number one, to demonstrate that he's in control, and also to protect his disciples. Now, by now, Jesus has already identified himself twice to the soldiers who came to arrest him. But that's not enough for Judas. Read Matthew 26, verses 48 through 50 at this point. Judas and the captain of the cohort had agreed on a sign or signal. His kiss will be the sign showing whom they should arrest. Therefore, they are not to arrest anyone until they see who Judas kisses. And although there is no need for him to proceed because Jesus has already identified himself, he insisted on earning his keep and keeping up with the charade. Now, Judas is warned again in Luke's account, verses 47 and 48. Go ahead and read those passages. So what happens as Judas approached Jesus? Well, even before the kiss is applied, Jesus warns him against proceeding. Once again, he gives Judas an opportunity to turn back to him. But still, Judas persists. And as Mark and Matthew record, he said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. Now, the Greek word here expressing this kiss is kataphaleo, and it means to kiss eagerly or affectionately or repeatedly. So he kissed him much, not one simple kiss, but many kisses. Now remember, these were kisses on the cheek, which was the common greeting. Now, the kissing of a rabbi was the means of submission to the rabbi, and for that reason it was considered sacred among the Jewish people. And when a man became a disciple of a particular rabbi, he would kiss the rabbi. And although Judas uses the term rabbi here, it is not a kiss of honor or of homage. It's a kiss of betrayal. He's profaning something that was sacred among the Jewish people of that time. Now, at this point, Peter decided to take action. Gotta love Peter. So go ahead and read John chapter 18 and verse 10. Now, the word sword here refers to a long ceremonial knife, the kind of knife that would be used to kill the Passover lamb. And it's likely the one that was used, that he and John used when they slaughtered the lamb for their Passover meal. Now, visualize, if you would, the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane at this moment. There were between 400 and 600 Roman soldiers, plus some Jewish temple police. And they had come to get Jesus, who is with how many disciples? 12. Remember now, all those Roman soldiers and all those temple Jewish police were all carrying their swords. So Peter pulls out his one long knife, and he thinks that he can pull off a Jewish Rambo here, I guess. And he very quickly proves that by profession, he's not a soldier, but a fisherman. He takes one swing at someone's head, misses, and cuts off the man's right ear. But notice his good Jewish wisdom. He did not attack a Roman soldier, and he did not attack a Jewish police officer. He attacked the servant of the high priest, who may or may not have been armed, probably not. And he cuts off the man's right ear. Now, Luke, in verse 51 of his account, records that he identifies the man, and he records the fact that Jesus restored this man's ear to the servant Malchus. Now, only Dr. Luke chooses to record that the ear was healed. Matthew, Mark, and John, for them, the most exciting thing is that in front of all these soldiers and police officers, Peter cut off the man's right ear. As far as putting the ear back on the head, they've seen greater things done by Jesus than that. But for Dr. Luke, it was a significant enough event to mention. And the healing, no doubt, saved the life of Peter. Then Jesus teaches Peter a very significant lesson. So go ahead and pause the video and read Matthew 26, verses 52 through 54. Now, what does Jesus mean by saying, all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword? Is it true that everyone who ever took up the sword was killed by a sword? For example, has every soldier who used a sword died from the wounds of a sword? Well, not necessarily. What then does Jesus mean? Well, to understand his meaning, we need to look at the statement in its context. Notice, first of all, the structure of what he says to Peter. Having told him to put away his sword, he then explains why the use of the sword is inappropriate. Why was it inappropriate? Well, Jesus told him, the Father has more than 12 legions of angels ready for immediate deployment at the request of his Son. And each legion is from 3,000 to 6,000 angels. So he did not need Peter's puny one long knife. So then, what is the contrast that Jesus is making? Well, the contrast is between the use of physical force and the use of spiritual force. This actually happens to be a spiritual conflict, not a physical one. And therefore, it must be fought by spiritual means. He's telling Peter to put away his sword because that sword is powerless in a spiritual conflict. In effect, he's saying, Peter, why are you using a sword? Don't you realize that this is a spiritual conflict between light and darkness? But he doesn't leave Peter there wondering. If it's a spiritual conflict and there are 12 legions of angels that are ready to rescue Jesus at his very beck and call, why isn't Jesus calling upon them? Well, he answers this question. If he uses the angels, how would prophecy be fulfilled? Now, why is it relevant that prophecy be fulfilled? Well, folks, if ever prophecy is not fulfilled, then God would become a liar. And I think we all know the consequences of that. So this is his lesson to Peter and to us. Peter, this is a spiritual battle. Swords are ineffective in spiritual battles. I have enough spiritual resources at my disposal to win the battle that you see before you. But you see, God has already determined and prophesied what must take place, and it will be so. And then Jesus speaks to the crowd in similar terms. So go ahead and pause here and read Matthew 26, 55 and 56. Now, what does he say to the crowds? Essentially, he is emphasizing that he's the one in control. Every day he was teaching among them, and they did not seize him. It was not for lack of trying, but they could not seize him before his time. But now they will be able to take him in order to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Now go ahead and read Luke's account, verse 53, to see another point that Jesus makes here. You see, they are acting, according to Jesus, in the power of darkness. And the spiritual conflict is a conflict between the power of darkness and the kingdom of light. Now go ahead and read the last part of Matthew, verse 56, and then John 18 and verse 12. The disciples decide to do no more. They don't defend themselves any longer, and they left him and fled. Jesus is now arrested and bound, and this is only possible because he chooses to submit to them, as he demonstrated when he identified himself to them. He is the one in control of the situation. Now, Mark adds something that is pretty interesting here, a detail that the others do not record. So pause and read Mark 14, verses 51 and 52. Here Mark adds a small incident about someone in the crowd having to flee away naked. Is this comic relief? Not at all. The purpose of these verses isn't to lay down a biblical basis for streaking either. What is the purpose of this story? Well, in ancient biographies, if the author was an eyewitness to some of the events, he would often include himself in the story where he was an eyewitness. For example, in John's Gospel, he refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, he's not implying that Jesus didn't love the other disciples as well. That's just the way John wrote himself into the story when he was an eyewitness. In the book of Acts, whenever Luke switches from third person into first person, that's where Luke is saying he's an eyewitness. So based upon the way biographies were written, the one mentioned here would be Mark himself. He happened to be there, and he was an eyewitness to the event that had just occurred. This is how Mark declares that he was an eyewitness to these events. Now, folks, as the night wears on, we will find 6 different trial proceedings. Some describe this as 6 different trials, but actually there will be only 2 separate trials, each of which has 3 separate segments. First, there's going to be a religious or Jewish trial. Then there will be a civil or Roman Gentile trial. Now, as you can see, there's a lot more for us to learn. So please join us next time as we dig deeper into this account and learn more about Jesus' final moments before the cross. Until next time, Shalom.